Can I turn now to the more controversial topics we were covering before on contested history? And it strikes me that few people, if any, will mourn the departure of Colston from his place in Bristol. And I think a lot of people would acknowledge, wherever they are on the political spectrum and their cultural viewpoint, they would acknowledge the sort of conflict that the mayor was talking about, where on the one hand you can abhor kind of mob action and say this is absolutely not the way to do it. But on the other hand, you can see the poetry of this individual being cast into the sea, reflecting a wicked act that he did to so many other people. But I think the question for many people is, how can you ever draw the line? So once you start this process, and even if it's not removal of statues, even if it is retain and explain, how far does it go? So are you only talking about people directly involved in slavery and specific atrocities, or anybody who was involved in our colonial past? Are you talking only about perpetrators, or are you also talking about beneficiaries? Is it only about those matters, or is it anybody who had a careless attitude towards their employees' safety or was religiously intolerant? What on earth do you do in Northern Ireland? So if you start this process, how could you ever know where to stop?
I think that's, in a way, you put your finger on it with the way you end it, is if you start this process, where do you stop in terms of removal? I think that explaining history and explaining historic figures is something that is always going to be an ongoing process. It will always be. Because you discover more, and historians will put different interpretations on particular individuals. And I think that that's why we so strongly take the view that our collective past is what it is. It is our historic fabric. It's the legacy that we have inherited from previous generations. And rather than removing contentious things, you need to reinterpret them, and reinterpret them in imaginative ways. And you asked the mayor of Bristol, why Colston's statue had been, why things hadn't been done, why it hadn't been moved, and he explained that, I think, the answer that there were sort of nobody could really agree. That was the sense I got. But actually, that statue stood on its own, on a plinth, on a square, and we, in 2018, actually commissioned an art competition to come up with ideas for the reinterpretation of the Colston statue. And one of the ideas, which actually was exhibited in an exhibition which we organised just across the road from here, the London Fire Brigade building, was of the Colston statue standing in the middle of a slave ship with slaves chained to the deck of the ship. And it was a hugely evocative art installation. Now, with modern technology, with the ability to show light sort of installations and so on, that might have been a way of addressing it. And you've seen some of this with light technology being adopted in the United States, with the challenges of Confederate statues. So I think there are lots of things that can be done to reinterpret and recontextualize, and also to recognise, these people. I mean, Colston was a very complex. It's a complex story, a brutal, slave trader, but also an extraordinary philanthropist. And these are painful issues in history, which actually we need to be open to and face up to. I mean, people are good and also bad, and of course we also are judging them by the standards of today. I mean, we have to acknowledge that the standards of 120 years ago, when that statue was actually put up, there were very, very different moral standards.
Let me ask you about some of the practicalities of it. So we heard from the Mayor earlier about the Commission on History for the City of Bristol, which is a perfectly good initiative. But if you tried to do that on a national sort of scale, I mean, where would you begin and where would you ever end? We get quite a lot of mail, I'm sure colleagues have as well, from constituents saying, why don't children learn about slavery in school? I have no idea where the idea comes from that children do not learn about slavery in school, because even in the 1970s and 80s we learned about slavery in school, and kids certainly do today. There's very little specified, as you know, in the national curriculum, with the sole exception of the Nazi Holocaust. It's down to the education system decides what is learned. I mean, do you think that system still works, and would it be practical to try and replace it with some sort of official version or agreed version, if you like, of our history?
I think it would be very difficult, because I'm not sure you'd ever agree on what was the right version of our history. I mean, people will always have different views, and there will be research which will uncover new facts about people. Archives will be found, letters, whatever. History is, it changes. I mean, the interpretation of history is constantly changing. So I think there are a number now of commissions which have been. The Mayor of London has a commission. There's the commission in Bristol you heard about. There's a commission which Oriel College have set up to consider the future of the Rhodes statue on the front of our Grade 2 star facade. And we could be. We could have lots of commissions.
And final question from me. There's a very splendid monument memorial in Highgate Cemetery to Karl Marx at his tomb. Assuming you're going to retain and explain, what do you think should be explained next to Karl Marx's tomb?
Well, I haven't visited Karl Marx's tomb, so I'm not sure quite what it does say. I know that it was earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, it was actually vandalised. I think it's I don't know if it's controversial.
But it would presumably mention Stalin's gulags and the purges. It would mention the Great Leap Forward and all the misery associated ultimately with Marxism. Who would agree? By what process would the words next to Karl Marx's tomb be agreed?
Yes, I can't. We would look to the owner of the Karl Marx tomb, which I
might
assume
be the Communist Party of Great Britain.
It may be. I'm not sure. Actually, it's in Highgate Cemetery, isn't it? So I suspect it would be owned by the.
I think they pay for the monument.
Yeah.
Anyway, no further questions.
No, it's a very interesting point actually, because it seems to be that, as you say, that if you did want to contextualise, and that is the view of your organisation, that's the way forward. It's agreeing the type of contextualised, the wording, the way in which it's done.
Yeah. Yes, and I think a lot of it will be achieved by sort of local discussion, and that's what you're seeing developing in Bristol, and I think that's important. But obviously, for a national or international figure, you can't just have a local discussion to resolve what, in the case of Karl Marx's tomb. Or
some of it would be impossible to do. Some of it would be impossible to do. If you were to contextualise, you talked about Karl Marx's tomb. Some of it is impossible.
I think it would be I think that would be difficult. But on the other hand, you obviously you can look up on digitally the explanation and of the background of any historic figure, and any listed statue. Actually, we maintain.
So the ones that can't be decided, you'd say just see Wikipedia then. Is that the?
Well, we could partly look at Wikipedia, but actually we maintain the National Heritage List for England, which is explains the background for listed buildings, listed structures. It includes reference to statues. It's a very large archive of documentation, but it's a living archive in that we encourage members of the public to enrich it, as we use the word, enrich the list, so they can add facts. It has to be factually accurate. They can add facts to a list description. So, part of the answer to your question, coming back, would be on Karl Marx, is to look at the National Heritage List for England and the description of the Marx tomb and enrich it, but it would have to be with facts.